There is a lot of content out there that focuses on the refugee situation in Europe, but a lot of this content focuses on select issues that don't quite grasp the complexity of the situation. This short video will attempt to give you an update of where asylum seekers are coming from, where they're going, and what types of issues are being raised in a country like Germany, who reported that in 2015, the mass migration of individuals to Europe meant that around 1 million asylum seekers crossed its borders. So let's start with where asylum seekers are coming from, and what's pushing them to leave their home nations. If we focus on the number of first-time applications within the EU made by asylum seekers from the Greater Middle East, Eurostat reported that in 2016, there were over 300,000 new applicants from Syria, over 180,000 from Afghanistan, 126,000 from Iraq, 47,000 from Pakistan, and 40,000 from people from Iran. Given that 54% of all applications within the EU came from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, let's have a closer look at these nations to understand why. If we start with Afghanistan, why is it that Afghanistan has consistently been a source of asylum seekers for the last half-century? To find out, it helps to understand a little bit about the proxy wars that were fought within the Islamic country of Afghanistan between the Christian nations of Great Britain and Russia. Over 150 years ago, British India invaded Afghanistan in 1839 in an attempt to exert influence over the Asian continent. This occurred again in 1878, and it wasn't until 1919 when Afghanistan was finally able to rid itself of Great Britain by taking advantage of World War I to declare its independence. Shortly afterwards, Afghanistan elected to become friendly with the Bolshevik regime by being one of the first to recognize their newly formed Soviet government. This favorable relationship lasted until the Soviets invaded in 1979 to support the Afghan communist government against anti-communist Muslim guerrillas. In the eyes of many Muslims, the invasion was seen as a direct attack on Islam, and Muslims from all over the world entered Afghanistan to fight with the Mujahideen against the Soviets. Among those who entered Afghanistan were the founders of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and what is known as ISIS today. The Soviets installed Babrak Kemal as leader, however the Mujahideen were able to provide heavy resistance funded and supported in some way or form by the US, Pakistan, China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. This support, along with large anti-communist sentiment, never allowed the Soviets to truly control Afghanistan, and the Soviets decided to end their occupation in 1989. However, the resultant destabilization in Afghanistan allowed the Taliban to rise to power in the mid-90s. In 2001, the September 11 attacks triggered a US-led invasion after the Taliban continued to provide refuge to Al-Qaeda and refused to hand over Osama bin Laden for questioning. 16 years later, US troops are still fighting the Taliban, and the probability of a positive outcome for the people is looking less and less likely. If we continue with Iraq, it would be reasonable to claim that the catalyst for today's instability occurred in 1990 when Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, initiating the First Gulf War. This move put Iraq into the international spotlight, and the country's leader, Saddam Hussein, now found himself with a target on his back. Unfortunately for Saddam, the interest in Iraq never really went away, and 13 years later, the Second Gulf War began after US and British governments claimed that Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction. The war quickly removed Saddam's largely Sunni government, and in its place, a Shia government was formed. However, the Shia government decided that the Sunni population should now be the ones who should be oppressed. This led to an increase in sectarian violence in 2006 that intensified again in 2012 and 2013, enabling ISIS to take large parts of western Iraq in 2014. Today, Iraqi armies together with Kurdish forces are currently trying to remove ISIS from Iraq, recently removing them from Iraq's second largest city, Mosul. After the defeat of ISIS, management of the remaining 20-odd foreign groups that have a vested interest in the outcome of the war will pose the greatest obstacle to peace. What further adds to the destabilization of Iraq is a direct neighbor that is also in the midst of a civil war. The country being referred to, of course, is Syria, the nation with the most displaced people in the world and the source of over 30% of all applications within the EU. Here, the ongoing crisis started when protesters were met by violent government oppression in 2011. In response to the violence, rebel factions were formed in an attempt to overthrow the country's autocratic government led by Bashar al-Assad. Since then, over half the population of Syria has become internally displaced or has fled the country. Like in Afghanistan and Iraq, there are foreign parties at play that are fueling the flames of war within Syria. However, of the three, Syria has the most uncertain future. The problem with Syria is that it's hard to imagine a clear winner emerging that will have the support of the people and the international community. If there is to be any reduction in the amount of asylum seekers making the journey to Europe, then the situation in either of these three nations needs to improve. But let's switch our focus now from the Middle East to Africa. In 2016, Eurostat reported that the top two sources of applicants within the EU were from Eritrea, with over 33,000, and Nigeria, with over 46,000. Many other nations have huge numbers of displaced persons within Africa, however most do not attempt to reach Europe. Somalia, for instance, is one of the largest source nations in the world with over 1 million refugees. The majority of these, however, reside in the neighbouring nations of Kenya and Ethiopia. In spite of Somalia's 1 million refugees, the UNHCR has recently reported that the largest and fastest growing source nation in Africa is South Sudan. The civil war that broke out in 2013 has meant that 1.4 million refugees have fled the country, with a vast number of these now residing in Uganda. The UNHCR also reported that 56% of the world's over 65 million displaced persons currently reside in Africa and the Middle East. With over 2.9 million refugees, Turkey is the leading host nation, followed by Pakistan with 1.4 million. The tiny country of Lebanon hosts over 1 million, a number that means that 1 in every 6 residents is a refugee. In Iran, there are just under 1 million refugees. Jordan hosts around 700,000, Ethiopia just under 800,000, and Uganda just under 1 million. In Europe, Germany hosts around 670,000 refugees and is the leader in application claims. However, Sweden hosts the most refugees as a percentage of the population. If we remain in Europe, Eurostat reported that there were well over 1.2 million new applicants for asylum in 2015 and just over 1.2 million in 2016. Between the years of 2015 and 2016, Germany received the most applications with over 1.1 million. Italy received over 200,000, Hungary 200,000, France 140,000, Sweden 180,000, and the UK around 80,000. Now that we have an idea of where asylum seekers are coming from and where they're going, let's have a look at a few issues that are being raised as a result of the refugee crisis. The first of these is the large consensus that the majority of asylum seekers are actually economic refugees. BAMF, the German Office of Migration and Refugees, disclosed that in 2016, 37% of applicants in Germany were granted refugee status, 22% were given a subsidiary protection, and 25% were outright rejected. Those who go on to receive refugee status are given access to language courses and can begin to work after a 3-month period in Germany. Of those who do not receive any form of protection status, some may apply again, some are deported, and some leave voluntarily. The problem that Europe is having with economic refugees is that it is difficult to deport them. Whether or not the asylum seeker comes from a safe country of origin or not makes the process of deportation much more complicated, even if the individual has no grounds to claim refugee status. Because it heightens the chance of acceptance, there is also the problem that asylum seekers will quite often get rid of all documentation. This means that host nations will often need to prove to an asylum seeker's native country that the individual is indeed a citizen before they will accept them back. The next issue is the belief that once refugees are accepted, they will never return. To see if this is the case, we can look at the Yugoslavian war that began in 1991 and ended 10 years later in 2001. The war left 140,000 dead and over 4 million refugees. According to the UNHCR, of the 4 million refugees, over 2.5 million have returned. So if you consider what happened in Yugoslavia, it's possible that over 50% of current refugees will return. However, only time will tell if Europe will see the same amount of returnees as it did in the late 90s and early 2000s at the end of the Yugoslavian conflict. Another issue that is being raised is the costs associated with the refugee crisis. The costs differ from country to country, but the German website Welt.de reported that Germany spent over 21.7 billion euros on the crisis in 2016, accounting for around 1.7% of the German government's general total expenditures for that year. Of the 21.7 billion, 9.3 went to the states and municipalities, 7.1 to addressing the root causes, 1.4 to the reception, registration, and accommodation of refugees, and finally 2.1 billion to the integration of individuals. Many would say that this money should go to Germany's hospitals, schools, and homeless, but this kind of expenditure does have some positive effects within the economy. Social workers are given jobs, language schools hire more staff, and the 2.1 billion spent on integration will give refugees the opportunity to enter the workforce, which, coincidentally, is the key to integration and the key to ensuring that Germany will see a long-term return on what can be seen as an investment into human capital. Now, however, we reach the big issue that seems to be plaguing the nations of Europe: the social and cultural problems presented by so many immigrants arriving with a range of different cultural backgrounds. The issue with these types of problems is that they are often hard to measure. They are factors that affect and damage society, for which there are hundreds, if not thousands, of potential culprits. However, one of the signs that might point towards a rising social problem, and something that has received a lot of media attention of late, is the apparent rise in crime within Europe. To scratch the surface of the issue, let's have a look at crime rates within Germany. According to the BKA, Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office, there were 994 attacks on asylum shelters in 2016. Of the 994 attacks, 169 were violent attacks, and 40% of violent attacks were arson attacks. If you compare this to 2014, there were only 199 attacks on shelters, and 28 of these were violent. This means that between 2014 and 2016, violent crimes against refugee shelters rose by over 500%. On the other side, the number of asylum seekers that were suspects in a crime in 2016 jumped by over 52% compared to that of 2015. The number of convicted offences by asylum seekers from the beginning of 2012 to the end of 2016 has increased from 63,400 to 293,476, an increase of 363%. Asylum seekers now account for 9.2% of all convicted offences. In comparison, in 2012, asylum seekers accounted for 2% of all convicted persons. However, according to the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, in 2015 and 2016, there were a combined number of 1.4 million asylum seekers that entered the country. Theft carried the most convicted cases, accounting for over 30% of all convicted crimes. This is followed by fraud at 25% and violent personal crimes at 23%. Sexually related convicted crimes accounted for just over 1% of convicted offences in 2016. In terms of who the crimes were being committed against, of all German victims, 4.6% of those were victims of crimes committed by asylum seekers. Of sexually related crimes, 9% of all German victims involved an asylum seeker. And if an asylum seeker was a victim, then in 79% of the cases, another asylum seeker was involved. As of 2016, asylum seekers are more criminal than their native German counterparts. They represent around 2% of the population, but are convicted for 9.2% of all crimes. So maybe there is a social problem that is developing in Germany, especially between the asylum seekers themselves. However, statistics on crime are almost never black and white. So before we come to this conclusion, there are a number of things that we need to take into account. The first thing that we have to consider is that these individuals are not, or not yet legally recognized as refugees. The combination of little to no working rights and a completely uncertain future will affect crime rates in a negative way. The demographics of asylum seekers coming to Europe also play a huge role. Between 2015 and 2016, just under 50% of all applications for asylum in Germany were made by males between the age of 14 and 40. Interestingly, 75.9% of all suspects were men in this age group. In comparison, slightly under 50% of the entire German population is male, and nearly 60% of the entire population is over the age of 40. Since young males commit the large amount of crime, regardless of the country, this accounts for a lot of the disparity in crime between asylum seekers and Germans. There are, of course, a multitude of other factors at play. The topic of crime in relation to asylum seekers really deserves its own video. In the following years, it will be important to recheck these numbers to see if the current rates of crime related to the population of asylum seekers changes. As of right now, it is difficult to reach a conclusion without data detailed enough. If we take into account all that we have discussed, the situation has clearly become far more complicated than many realize. Since 2015, the number of displaced persons has actually increased, and a series of controversial issues are being raised that lie in the political grey zone. When it comes to asylum seekers, the questions are seldom easy, the answers never clear. We need to be cautious of reductive solutions to the types of problems that were raised in this short video. The obstacles facing these source nations are deep-seated, and it's unlikely that we'll see any drastic improvement in the near future. If the worldwide number of displaced persons continues to rise, how will Europe and the rest of the world react?